This is a revision video for Nuages, the first movement of Debussy's 3 Nocturnes. I'm going to talk through the piece, playing little sections a bit at a time while explaining what is going on. That's going to constitute the main part of the video. Just before I do that, I'm just going to talk about the overall structure briefly and a few important concepts that will help you understand the detail of the piece. Debussy and his slightly younger colleague Ravel are often known as Impressionist composers. Although it's not a label of which they were particularly fond, it does have some genuine explanatory power because there are some real correspondences between the way in which they approach music and the way in which Impressionist painters like Claude Monet, from which the term comes, approached painting. As you can see from these two paintings from Monet's Rouen Cathedral series, the emphasis is very much on impression, colour, atmosphere, rather than on, in this case, the architectural detail of the cathedral. And you can hear the same sort of priorities in Debussy's and Ravel's music. They are concentrating not on producing on the whole a very clear melody with clear phrasing set against a very clear accompaniment. They're not concentrating on the clarity of harmony and tonal structure that we get in the classical period. They're much more interested in orchestral colour, in harmonic colour. So when you have chords like dominant sevenths, they're used not in a functional way, not to help us know what key we're in, but just as a colour in their own right. And we'll see some very good examples of that in Nuages from Debussy's Nocturnes in a second. You can find a more general introduction to Impressionism and other early 20th century musical styles by following the link to the video here. One of the ways in which Debussy shifts the focus from functional, clear harmony to colourful, more ambiguous harmony and tonality is through his use of exotic scales such as the whole tone, the pentatonic and the octatonic scales. Debussy's piano prelude, Voile, which means sails or veils, is a very good example of this, where we just have a wash of whole tone harmonies which are necessarily ambiguous. You only can have augmented triads, nothing functional at all, and because of the lack of semitones, there's no sort of differentiation of the tonal space at all. We're just lost in a cloud of undifferentiated whole tones. Debussy does make use of the whole tone scale, and indeed the pentatonic scale, in this movement, as we shall see. But by far the most important scale in Nuages is the octatonic scale. I've done a video concentrating on that scale, which you can link to here, but it is worth just outlining some of the most important properties as they apply to this particular piece. This is the B octatonic scale found in Nuages. As you can see, it consists of alternating tones and semitones, a tone from B to C sharp, and a semitone to D, a tone to E, and so on, which means that we have the bottom half being a B minor scale and the top half being an F minor scale. So the segments of the scale themselves are relatively normal and you can get some pretty ordinary sounding music out of that, but the way in which they relate to each other by a tritone, B to F, has some strange consequences, and it particularly has some strange consequences for the harmonies. As you can see on this slide, it is possible to construct what sound like ordinary functional tonal chords using the notes of this scale. You have to mess around a bit with enharmonic equivalents, but these chords are available. So you can see the second chord along there based on C sharp. You can have a C sharp minor chord and a C sharp major chord, and then with its minor seventh, the dominant seventh. So minor chords, major chords, dominant seventh, that's all the sort of building blocks of tonal music. What undermines any sense of tonality, though, is where these chords are possible and the relationship between those chords. So if you look at the first note, the B, which was going to be our tonic, our B tonic, you can't get any sort of stable chord over that B. We can only get that B diminished chord. And obviously that's going to fatally undermine really any sense of the B as a major or minor key being established. And the notes where we can get major and minor chords, C sharp, and then E, and then G, and then B flat, are minor thirds apart. And if you take every other one, tritones apart. So there's a tritone from C sharp to G, and there's a tritone between E and B flat. What you absolutely can't get, and this is where we can't get any sense of tonal functionality, is you can't have a major or a minor chord or a dominant seventh chord a fifth or a fourth apart. And in order to have any proper sense of tonality, we have to have that ability to have a perfect cadence. If we were in B, it would be from F sharp, a major chord on F sharp, to a minor chord on B. And that simply isn't possible using this scale. So although this piece begins and ends with B's, and you can see at the very end of the piece here, in the last 4 bars, it sort of fades out onto just B's on their own. Because Debussy is using this B octatonic scale, what we can't get is any proper sense of B minor or B major. So it's not B in any proper tonal sense. What you can see is at the very end, it's simply just B's on their own, the note B. But in the previous 2 bars, you can see that we have a chord, but it's not a B tonic chord, it's actually a G7 chord. So that gives a very sort of cloudy, misty effect to the harmony. We've got B as a centre, but a harmony which doesn't really support that B. So I'm just going to play those last 4 bars now. At the beginning of Nuages, Debussy opts for a slightly less pure form of octatonicism. As you can see from this piano score of the opening, overlaid against the B octatonic scale, a lot of the notes are taken from the octatonic scale, but some crucial ones are borrowed from a more familiar scale, that of B minor. So in particular, if you look at the first chord there, which is just a B and an F sharp, the B obviously is part of the scale, but the F sharp is not. Debussy is just giving us a little bit more tonal stability, establishing his B a little bit more before going on to undermine it in various ways, particularly at the end, as we've just seen. So we'll now listen to this opening few bars. The tonality is a bit like the forest in this painting. You can make it out, especially if you know it's there, but it's very much obscured by the dark atmosphere, by the clouds. Before I walk you through the piece, I want us just to look at the overall structure. And just before doing that, it's worth returning to the Monet paintings which I started this video with. The structure in the Debussy can be compared very helpfully with these in that we have material that appears and reappears in different colours and atmospheres, just like Rouen Cathedral in these paintings. So you can see that the basic idea of the structure is pretty simple. Debussy has two ideas, X and Y, and he alternates them throughout the piece. So we have what you might call rotations of the material. It keeps coming round again and again. And each time the material comes round, just like in the Monet, it has different light and colour. And of course, in a musical sense, that means different orchestrations, different textures, different harmonic colour around them. Of course, this isn't a classical piece, it's impressionist, so you don't get the same sort of structural clarity that you would expect in a piece of sonata form or a rondo or a minuet and trio or whatever. The lengths of the rotations are very different, and one of the reasons for that is that as the piece unfolds, Debussy increasingly adds new material in between the X and Y rotations, and I've called these insertions of material interpolations. The material is interpolated between X and Y, or inserted in between, and I've marked them I on this slightly modified structural diagram. And you can see that there's no interpolation in rotation 1, a shortish one in rotation 2, a slightly longer one in rotation 3, a very long one in rotation 4, comparatively more than 15 bars, and then a very short one of just 1 bar in rotation 5. And we should of course look at those interpolated sections when we go through the whole piece in a more detailed way. Finally, it's worth mentioning that in the 4th rotation, the interpolation is not only quite a bit longer, but also has a very distinctive character, with almost fully pentatonic scale used for most of the interpolation. So it really does form quite a strong contrast to the rest of the material around it. And for that reason, some people have interpreted this piece as a sort of loose ternary form, with the X and Y rotations forming a long initial A section and then a brief contrasting pentatonic B section, which is the interpolation in what we're calling rotation 4, and then a return to the X and Y material in the last part of the piece, forming a final A section. So now let's work our way through the piece section by section, starting with the first rotation and the presentation of the X material, which, as you can see, is only 4 bars, but it has some important features that we'll see return again and again each time this X material comes back at the beginning of each rotation. You can see from the score that the opening is quite sparse, just the clarinets and the bassoons playing initially, and they're joined by one of the oboes in the second 2 bars. I would identify 4 main features of this X material that reappear in virtually all of the rotations. One is the homophonic texture, all the parts moving together. Second is the rhythm of continuous crotchets in all the parts, obviously. Thirdly, the distinctive 6-note figure, which starts with an auxiliary note and is very similar, in fact, to the Dies Irae theme found in many other works. And finally, it's worth mentioning the heavily octatonically inflected B minor tonality. So we've got a sort of mixture of B minor, but with lots of octatonic inflections, lots of notes from the B octatonic scale in there as well, as I explained a little earlier. Debussy then immediately introduces the Y material, which is quite contrasting in many ways, as we can see on the score. As with the X material, the Y material has a set of features or properties that give it its distinctive sound. So first of all, there is a corngay melody with a distinctive triplet semiquaver figure, and that spans a tritone from the top to the bottom. So that's a written C to a written F sharp, which is actually an F to a B in sounding pitch. And that melody is metrically dissonant, so it's in 4/4, whereas everything else is still in the 6/4 that the rest of the piece is in. In many of the rotations, there's also a G dominant 7th chord, very distinctively octatonic with this B centre, but this G7 chord underpinning the melody. And then at the bottom of the texture, there's a rumbling timpani B pedal. One important difference to this Y section compared to the X section is that it is wholly octatonic, which is why those harmonies as it fades out sound so mysterious. We get the G chord giving way to just a 2-note chord, a B and a G sharp, a chord change that wouldn't happen in any diatonic tonality. The second rotation of X and Y is a little expanded, but it basically just takes the same material and adds some different orchestral and harmonic colours around it. Again, like those Monet paintings we were looking at. You can see on the score that the first 2 bars are very much the same as bars 1 and 2 in the first rotation. The difference is that we have the material presented on violins instead of on woodwinds, and also a bit more doubling, so the first violins are playing the same music an octave higher than the second violins, which adds a different colour to it as well. There's not a copyright-free recording of this work, so I can't play the whole piece in little bits, but I will play bar 14 because that adds a colour that we haven't heard before and that is very distinctive in Debussy's music and Impressionist music in general, and that is he takes an added note chord, in this case a dominant 9th, and then he plays a whole series of those chords in parallel, so the functionality is totally erased really, and instead we just get the colourful sound of these descending 9th chords. We also get for the first time in this rotation some interpolated material between X and Y. And you can see that in bar 17, where there's a more pentatonic feel to the melody, certainly, although all the harmonies aren't taken from the same pentatonic scale necessarily, and indeed it even changes pentatonic scale in the actual melody itself. But there's a distinctively different flavour to these 4 bars that are inserted before the Y material comes back. In the last bar of this page, the Y material returns, and you can see on the structure diagram where we now are in the piece. As with the X material in rotation 2, the presentation is pretty similar. the cor anglais melody is still there, and we've still got that metrical dissonance, the 4/4 against the 6/4, although now it's rather more obvious because, as you can see, the violins and the violas are now playing crotchets, rather like, in fact, the X material with its crotchets and the crotchets of the 6/4 in the accompaniment against the 4/4 of the cor anglais melody make that rhythmic instability much more easy to hear. The harmonic colour is also different. We've got basically what amounts to a G9 chord here, which adds a note that isn't in the octatonic scale. So unlike the first Y rotation, where the notes were only from the B octatonic scale, here we have one extra note, an A, which actually makes the collection of notes being used also coincide with what's called the G acoustic scale, which is basically a G scale with a raised fourth and a flattened seventh. On the next page, in bar 23 of the score, we hear a new feature that didn't figure in the previous rotation of the Y material. In the horns, the second and third instruments down in the score, we hear a falling two-note idea, which spans an F sharp to a C. In written pitches, a concert B to an F. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it is. It's the same interval that the cor anglais melody itself spans. So Debussy is sort of distilling that melodic idea and just boiling it down to those two notes that the melody spans. And these two notes come back many times in the rest of the piece. So here is that idea with the beginning of the rotation before it. Debussy also extends this rotation of the Y material a little simply by repeating the cor anglais melody. You can see that beginning in the last two bars of the page of the score that's up on the screen at the moment. So now we're on to the third rotation, and here the X material is quite a bit different from the presentations of it that we've heard before, not least because that distinctive melody is now substantially changed. The texture's quite similar, the rhythm is the same pretty much, with perhaps a little bit of extra syncopation, but that melody is very much changed. And in fact, this is the X presentation that is least typical. When we get into the next two rotations, we're back to something much closer to what we heard at the beginning. The other thing that's different in this rotation is that in both of the previous presentations of the X material, we started off with a bare fifth, just B and F sharp, whereas here we actually have a proper B minor triad. And in fact, all of the crotchet chords are triads, which makes the texture fuller as well as the contrast of that different melody. The interpolation that follows in bar 33 adds another new colour. Now we have a very definite whole tone flavour emerging. So although there's other notes as well, there's a strong emphasis on C's and D's and E's and F sharps, that whole tone spanning a tritone, of course. After that interpolation, we move on to the presentation of the Y material in the third rotation. And just like the previous incarnation of this Y material, we get the cor anglais melody pretty much the same, although again it's repeated, but the harmony and texture around it is shifted again to give a different colour to the background of this music. We're back to notes that are purely taken from the B octatonic scale, but now we have an alternation of two chords. The second one is our familiar G7 on the second crotchet of each pair, but the first is a much more difficult to analyse note. You could call it B13 or something, but it's basically pretty dissonant. Debussy also adds some intriguing instrumental detail. So not only do we have different chords, but they're presented in a much more colourful way. So on the beat, we've got both arco strings and pizzicato strings. You can see that the second violin top part are playing pizzicato and the cello lower part as well on the beat. And then to add to both rhythm and texture, you also get repeats of those notes, pizzicato on the offbeat as well in the upper cello and the upper viola. The fourth and longest rotation starts fairly innocuously. The X material at bar 57 is much more like the presentations of that material that we saw at the beginning in bar 1 and bar 11. The familiar melody is back for a start. We haven't heard the melody played on the oboes before, but apart from that, it's very much the same as it was the first time it appeared. And what's different is the viola solo that you can see halfway down the page there. And when you listen to the full recording all the way through, you'll hear that that really has quite a big impact on the overall feel of this presentation of the X material. We now arrive at the most contrasted section of the piece, and that's the rather longer interpolation that happens in the middle of rotation 4. This is where the music goes pentatonic, and you can hear it really is a change of atmosphere. It's almost like after all the fog and mist of the octatonic harmonies, the sun has come out. Despite the contrasts, there are, however, some correspondences with the earlier material, and perhaps the most obvious can be seen here at figure 8, where the material from this interpolation fades out, using a melody that we've seen also used to extend the end of the Y section. For example, in bar 51, where you've got that same pattern, ba-da-da, a falling second and then a falling minor third. After that rather longer interpolation, which also serves as a sort of B section, we then return to Y in perhaps its most harmonically colourful presentation. The section starts in bar 80 with the familiar G7 chord that we've seen many times before in association with the Y material. But after only 2 bars, Debussy changes to a different dominant 7th chord, this time on the strings tremolo and with horns as well, on a C sharp dominant 7th, which obviously that shift from G dominant seventh, the C sharp dominant seventh, isn't a functional one. This is very much cycling through the harmonies which are available in the octatonic collection and create that very distinctive exotic harmonic flavour. Over the page we get yet another dominant seventh chord in bar 86. We've now got an E7 chord. So we've now had 3 different dominant seventh chords in the space of very few bars. And you can see that Debussy is literally going through the dominant sevenths available in the octatonic collection he's using. So you can see Debussy has used 3 of the 4 possible dominant seventh chords from the collection. The first 3, in fact, C sharp, E and G dominant sevenths. He doesn't use that final one on the example there, the B flat dominant seventh. And he's using these chords for 2 reasons. One, for colour, this constantly changing atmosphere and colour that Debussy is interested in creating, but also it's helping create the ambiguity and the murkiness that Debussy wants to portray in Nuages, which after all means clouds. The final rotation is really something very different. Whereas rotations 2, 3 and 4 have been about expanding and changing colour in relation to the first rotation, rotation 5, the final rotation, is much shorter and all the material is fragmented and reduced, and it's almost like the X and Y material is disappearing into the mist. It becomes more ambiguous, harder to hear as we go through this final presentation of the material. You can see in bar 94 that the X material comes back much lower. First of all, it's in the bassoons there, and it's fragmented. We only have a bar of it, and then half a bar of nothing melodically, and then it tries to pick up again, and then it transfers into the cellos and basses. So we have this very sort of dark, fragmented presentation, almost like it's disappearing into the depths. After that fragmented X, we get an even paler imitation of the warm and sunny pentatonic interpolation that we heard in the last rotation. So in bar 98, the second bar of this system, you can see just that lonely pentatonic flute melody with virtually no accompaniment at all, unlike the much richer accompaniment that this material had last time around. I played you the final bars of the piece earlier in this video, but I will just play them again so you can hear how after that pale imitation of the pentatonic interpolation from rotation 4, we now have an even more fragmented version of the Y material that we've heard. The melody isn't there, we've just got the falling tritone and rumbling B's going on in the background, and that G7 chord keeping it tonally unstable, so it really ends in an octatonic fog. So the overview provided in this video should provide you with a good starting point for your revision. You now need to go look at an annotated score, really make sure you've got all the details in there and you really understand them within the wider context that I've set out in this revision video. And finally, you should of course go and listen to it several times with the score, bearing all these things in mind, really trying to understand this music musically as well as intellectually.